Hello, everyone. My name is Margaret Leinen. I'm the director of Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you to the annual Knowlton Jackson Lecture. Within a very broad array and portfolio of ocean science, atmospheric science, earth science, climate science here at Scripps Oceanography, conservation plays a very important role. In fact, our short title for what we do is Understanding and Protecting the Planet. And you see that strong conservation theme come out in that protecting the planet. The global challenges that we face all have very deep roots in connection with conservation. Not conservation for conservation's sake, or even the very important conservation for biodiversity, but because the sustainability of our environment, the sustainability of the ocean, it means our sustainability. So every one of these big, difficult issues that we deal with affects us as individuals, us as society, and that's why conservation plays such an important role. Nancy Knowlton, Jeremy Jackson, Enrique Sala, and Sarah Mesnick founded the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation about 20 years ago. And we are very fortunate to have three of them with us on this webinar, Nancy, Jeremy, and Sarah. It represents an opportunity for us to explore interdisciplinary science and the way that conservation plays into all of the things that we're interested in science, all of the ways that we protect the planet, all of the ways that we ensure the sustainability of our environment and the ocean. In addition to the interdisciplinary research that's done at the Center for Marine Conservation and Biodiversity, education is an important factor as well. The center offers a Master of Science, a PhD in this area, and also Masters of Advanced Study in Conservation and Biodiversity. And that latter is an opportunity for us to bring in people who are already working in the field and give them the opportunity for a year-long experience directly related to the action on conservation and biodiversity. So this entire program really is focused on such a broad array of issues. Nancy and Jeremy also founded this lecture series, and the speakers were meant to really epitomize the translation of science into action. This is such a focus for our students. The students of today, the generation of today, wants to do science, but they want it connected at the hip with action. And so to enhance that, to showcase it, we use the Knowlton Jackson lecture series. And we're going to hear today from one of our most accomplished alums who exemplifies action in conservation science, and another important speaker. And I'm going to turn things over to Nancy and Jeremy for those introductions now. And thank you, Nancy and Jeremy, so much for making it possible for us to continue to have this important and very lively lecture series.
Hello, good afternoon, good evening. Greetings from rural Maine. We're really pleased to be here with you, and thank you, Margaret, for that wonderful introduction. We've hosted these talks for a number of years now, but this is the first time we've ever done it virtually. And in fact, because of the pandemic, we initially had to postpone it. But I think one of the things we've really learned during the course of this pandemic is how actually one of the powers of doing things virtually is the ability to reach more people. And so we're really pleased to be able to host this webinar virtually and thereby have an audience actually much greater than any of the previous audiences we've had previously to this time. So I don't want to take away from the time from the speakers. You're really in for a treat, I can tell you. But I just wanted to say thanks to all of you for attending, and enjoy the next hour and a half. Jeremy?
Oh, I have not much more to add, except that we're in for an incredible treat from the two speakers that we're going to have. It's very exciting to me to see, in the case of Mike, the way he has developed from the time I last taught him, and also a super pleasure to have Patricia come in and talk about a project that is famous around the world and the amazing accomplishments she's had. So I'll leave it at that. We're thrilled that there's such a big audience, and we look forward to doing this many more times in the future.
Hello, and thank you, Nancy and Jeremy. Great to see you again. And thanks to Stuart and Allison for the invitation to introduce this year's Knowlton Jackson speakers and to celebrate with all of you their outstanding achievements in marine conservation. We invited the speakers to share their views on the state of the oceans and their visions on achieving protection of biodiversity and human well-being. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Navarro, selected as the 7th CNBC alumni speaker. Mike is assistant professor in marine fisheries at the University of Alaska Southeast. Prior to joining the faculty in 2016, he earned a Distinguished National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellowship and his PhD in oceanography from Scripps in the CNBC cohort of 2014. Mike received his Bachelor's of Science from UCLA, his Master's from Cal State Fullerton, and worked as a marine biologist for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife before coming to Scripps. And from my very first time chatting with Mike up at CUPS, he knew that he wanted to do science in supportive management, but also to open the doors of science to many others. Mike's research addresses two of the most important pressing questions of our day. How will climate change affect our oceans, and how can we inspire and engage talent from the most diverse minds and voices to help us meet this challenge? Much of his work focuses on market squid, a critically important forage species in the California current ecosystem and the largest fishery by volume in the state, and a species with warming that has now expanded its range into Southeast Alaska, following Mike there. His contributions have expanded our understanding of the biology and the dynamics of this key species and provide the sound scientific foundation upon which we can ensure that marine fisheries remain sustainable for both communities and ecosystems. In his days at Scripps, Mike was at the forefront of efforts to face up to the difficult issues around race. He devoted time and attention to mentoring under-recruited students in science and serving as the coordinator of the inaugural year of Scripps Focus on the Future program, leading the first research cruise with high school students and opening doors to the world of oceanography. He joined Scripps and UCSD's efforts to address the charring campus race events in 2010 and helped to pave a pathway to meaningful change that continues today. Mike was recognized for these efforts with UCSD Chancellor's Diversity Awards and served on the University of California's Affirmative Action and Diversity Committee. Of his many awards for scholarly achievement and commitment to equal opportunity, Mike is the National Academy's Distinguished Young Scientist and Woods Hole Deep Submergent Science Leader. He received the AAAS Linton Poudry Leadership Award from the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science, and he was elected to the prestigious Edgar Boucher Graduate Honors Society. Mike leads by example, challenging us to face old mindsets and to build new systems that foster knowledge exchange, mutual trust and understanding, and increase inclusivity across academia, science, and sustainability. I can think of no better alum to represent CNBC and present their vision for achieving both protection of our planet's biodiversity and championing human diversity. It is my pleasure to welcome to the Zoom stage, Dr. Michael Navarro.
All right. Greetings from Alaska. So let's see here. Thank you for that warm introduction, Sarah. Very much appreciate that. My name is Dr. Michael Navarro. And as Sarah mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of marine fisheries here at the University of Alaska Southeast. Here, I live as a guest on the traditional lands of the Tlingit people, and I live on the territory of the Akwán. The Tlingit have been stewards of these lands since time of immemorial, and it shows. As a kid from Long Beach, I've never lived in a place with such clean air and water and spectacular landscapes. Gracias, thank you, and gonos chish. The image that I'm showing you was taken on the traditional lands of the Sadan Kwan with 2 students in my oceanographic expedition course. I want to thank the Knowlton Jackson Distinguished Lecture organizers, especially Dr. Mesnick, who has been an invaluable mentor for me over the years. And I need, of course, to acknowledge Drs. Jackson and Knowlton for having the vision and the ability to create a program that generates diverse and broad solutions to the biggest challenges to marine biodiversity and conservation. I'm truly humbled and honored to be here, and I'm so grateful to speak in front of Dr. Majluf because, like many of you, I admire her work very much. Before I get to my talk, I just want to highlight a couple of the fantastic opportunities that I had with the CNBC program that have been formative in my career development. And so I just wanted to thank for Dr. Jackson and Dr. Knowlton for having the vision to create a program with such broad reach and for solutions towards such of the big challenges that we face on our planet. I just want to thank the few items with CNBC, the interdisciplinary approach. It challenges us to think both on the interdisciplinary level towards solutions so that we're thinking outside of the box, which I never had before. And also having this incredible connection through the global network with cohorts that are established around the planet is a tool set that is invaluable. I also want to acknowledge CNBC's commitment to inclusive and excellence. When I arrived, this has always been a value that's been a core for me. Targeted efforts to recruit from under-recruited communities, the support with the Society for the Advancements of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science for our SACNAS members. We refer to ourselves as SACNistas, and there's always been support for SACNAS. So that when there are critical issues that occur on campus, I felt like I could always be myself here, and we were able to do some amazing things with the community, such as with Compton High School, and develop authentic and real relationships with under-recruited communities. I'm still friends with Dr. Lori Holloway here, and I have her son as a student in one of my classes. But I just want to emphasize that this can only occur with the community by co-designing and co-creating programs. I also want to thank CNBC for their push for international collaboration so that students can work with the experts from all across the planet. I chose to do an internship with the South Africa and the Department of Environmental Affairs because they have a squid fishery where they incorporate climate science to inform management. And that was incredibly inspiring and helped me to lead efforts in research towards market squid here on the west coast of North America. So with that, I will go ahead and get into my talk today on Alaska, and I'm going to touch on 2 topics. One on climate change impacts on forage species in Southeast Alaska, and the second on developing resilient researchers from highly impacted rural coastal communities. So first, Alaska has perhaps the longest history of coastal stewardship in North America, with a history that expands well over 10,000 years with our diverse indigenous communities. Also, Alaska is huge, lots of habitat, over 75,000 kilometers of coastal habitat. And for comparison's sake, that California has roughly 5,500. So it's a challenge. The coastal habitat's also very diverse. There's 5 large marine ecosystems here. And what this means is that there are along this coastline that these areas are distinct in their bathymetry, hydrography, productivity, as well as trophically dependent populations. But for sake of time, I'm going to just focus on the Gulf of Alaska. And climate change is impacting Alaska at the fastest rate of any state in the United States. And it's among the fastest rates on the planet. Ocean warming is increasing here, as indicated with this graphic. Ocean acidification is intensifying. Stratification and deoxygenation are also ramping up, creating challenges for our population. So climate change is occurring over vast areas of Alaska, heavily impacting our rural communities. Just here in Southeast Alaska alone, we have over 30,000 kilometers of coastal habitat and only around 70,000 residents. So to answer a question or find evidence for our forage species in the Gulf of Alaska experiencing this phase shift in response to climate changes actually can be quite challenging. There are many forage species in Southeast Alaska, including capelin, herring, sand lance, hooligan, pollock, and squid. And so I wanted to focus my attention on a new player in this system, market squid. Transitions are important to focus on because what they represent when they change in forage species is potential changes with the fishery harvest, as well as changes with our federally protected predators, such as our marine mammals. So on the left is just a diagram from Agira 2015 that shows how a system that was once, or when it's squid dominated, how a fishery will target squid. The bubbles here show the amount of harvest of that particular species and how that can change when oceanographic conditions change and the species composition changes. So here's a transition that occurred over a Pacific decadal oscillation where the fishery went from fishing squid to fishing sardine. Move that forward to 2009, the fishery was fishing sardine and then transitioned into squid as environmental conditions changed. These kind of changes also occur with our predators. So on the y-axis here, this is the percent occurrence of squid in the diet of sea lions. And there are 3 populations of sea lions here, and you can see how their diet changes over the years in response to changes in these fisheries communities. So historically, market squid aren't present in Alaska. They are, it's in a highly unusual event. And when they're here, we notice them. And so on this time series, there's been a few warming events that have occurred. And when this has occurred, market squid have had temporary extensions into Southeast Alaska. But as you might notice, this is a pretty big warming event that occurred here where we experienced both a large El Nino as well as multiple marine heat waves. So what does that mean? What did the market squid respond? Well, we gathered data for market squid from 2014 to 2019, worked in collaboration with a series of partners at NOAA, as well as with the community. And we have evidence of bottom seawaters warming pretty significantly, as well as market squid being reported all throughout, extending much farther than Southeast Alaska into South Central Alaska, all the way to Kodiak Island. We also were able to work with partners to gather samples of these squid, both through the Gulf of Alaska as well as at communities such as at Sitka. And from here, we have strong evidence that market squid not only extended, but the way that they extended into the Gulf of Alaska changed significantly. They extended farther. So going from Southeast Alaska, extending all the way to Kodiak, and they extended into the system for much longer. So instead of weeks, they extended for years. So what does this mean for forage species here, for fisheries and for our predators in our ecosystem? Well, that's what we're working on to try to understand how this is going to change into the future. I want to transition to my next slide project, which is how can we build resilient researchers in our rural communities that are heavily impacted by climate change. We have so many aspects of climate change that are happening here, from our sea ice melting to stratification, as mentioned, warming, as well as ocean acidification and deoxygenation. So trying to develop tool sets so that we can team up with larger institutions so that we can provide the best training for our populations that are heavily impacted by climate change. These affect the livelihoods and lives of our people here. We also provide training for carbon neutral and zero impact oceanographic data collection, as well as providing training for resilience, as these events are known to have mental impacts on our people. And so we set up here at the University of Alaska, we have open admissions. So we take anyone from the community into our college, and it's setting up a biological oceanography class here that has student cruises, research cruises, modeled much after my education at Scripps, so that we can train our rural students in oceanographic practices. This is our first cruise that we took right outside of Juneau. I've also, as part of a team, have led efforts for an oceanographic expedition course where we train sustainability and connecting to nature, physics, chemistry, biology, science communication at places that are extremely impacted by climate change. This year, we're going to head to Taku Inlet, and I'm hoping to add to this expedition members that will focus on geology, glaciology, as well as indigenous science. This is a highlight from one of my students that was done in collaboration with Dr. Matthias Cape, where we were out and collecting CTD samples in Endicott Arm, and Michaela decided to repeat samples that were taken in 1967. And so this is to give you an idea of how our fjord systems are changing. These are temperature differences between, between the two sample dates. So I'm going to close my talk with just saying that I think the next need that we have, that our students really want, is more training in the co-production of knowledge in ocean research. And what I mean by that is to expand, in addition to our interdisciplinary approach towards solution, to also including new epistemologies, new ways of thinking, so that we can join together more solutions to these growing needs that work for all communities. One of my fondest memories at UAS so far was an invitation I had from a colleague of mine in the Kliak Yaak gathering. And at this gathering, we had thought leaders that included Dr. Lance Twitchell, Nainoa Thompson, that some of you may be familiar with his work. He was a plenary speaker at this year's Ocean Sciences, as well as Dr. Linda Ferruto. And it was just amazing to be part of that. And I'll put here what this gathering was about for you to look at. So I think that there are just outstanding opportunities that we have in this arena, but it requires meaningful connections. And oftentimes when we think about our grants, we think about our making efforts in terms of monetary resources. But I also would like to add that that also includes that we need to include our time resources. Our communities need us, we need to know our communities. And so it requires time and open-mindedness to new epistemologies that we may not be experienced with. And basically we need to commit to our communities in the same way that we commit to marine biodiversity conservation and our love for marine biodiversity conservation, and we need to stand together with our communities. So with that, I'll close my talk, and I just want to say gracias, thank you, and buenos dias. And if there's time for questions, I'm happy to take any.
Thank you so much, Mike, very much for the visuals of where you are now and the work that you're doing. We open it up to questions. Put your questions in the Q&A box down at the bottom. And I see a question from Dan Conley to you, Mike. What are some of the impacts of the market squid's persistent expansion into Alaskan waters?
That's a fantastic question. We're trying to get an assessment on that. Our fisheries obviously express concerns for this immediately, especially hatcheries, the salmon hatcheries, and that market squid are thought to potentially be eating salmon fry. So that's one thing that has occurred. More prominently, I would say that people have started to include them in their diet. There was a request for a new fishery. It didn't pass, but there's definitely interest in the communities as far as maybe creating a new fishery.
Thanks. I have a question for you about scale. We tend to think of climate and oceanographic research being done on large spatial scales, yet you've scaled oceanographic research to communities. Why, can you chat some more about why you find it important to engage communities in these issues that are in their backyard, but expand, span the globe?
For one, they're very knowledgeable about their coastal habitats. And so by expanding these connections, we can amplify efforts that we are already doing. And so increasing community, it increases things such as action plans, making action plans that are really centered on the community needs can be enacted much quicker than can any kind of action plans that aren't based there. So that's one of my primary ways. But also in a rural area like Southeast Alaska, having a network of communications where people are talking to one another helps oceanographers to, for example, to know like where market squid are at. Having that connection is completely, it's so valuable. So it's a strategy that has been practiced here in Southeast Alaska for millennia, and it's just kind of how things are successfully done here.
And a question from Ileana Alexander, following on that line of thinking. How do you integrate and balance the values of knowledge needs of different ways of knowing, such as traditional knowledge, scientific knowledge, social science knowledge? How do you integrate and balance these?
That's a good question. There's all kinds of, there's no silver bullet. A lot of this work is really hard work. It takes a lot of time and conversation to understand others' perspectives, but it goes to something that just came up. Dr. Knowlton mentioned this recently, but it comes down to trust. And so there's going to be some epistemologies that certain groups aren't going to be able to understand from another group. But if there's trust, there's a much more willingness to kind of come to solutions where that can be built up. So yeah, hopefully that gets to that question.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Here we have one. Yes, Catherine Grady has a question for you. Have you seen evidence of squid egg laying beds in Southeast Alaska or in South Central, like we have off the coast here, famously in La Jolla?
Yeah, so there's all kinds of just novel interactions, but our fishermen are the ones that most commonly find them. Our market squid are pretty distinct in how they like to lay their eggs, where our large groupings of predators are absent, such as on sandy plains or in areas that are kind of away from things. And in here, the market squid will lay their eggs a lot of times on fishing gear. So the ones that we know about, so like on crab pots or in Little Port Walter, for example, on their king salmon net pins. And so we see them there. So it's not quite the same. I have yet to see a bed like in La Jolla, but I think it's going to be pretty short here that you guys will see some video from me on a bed showing it to you guys.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Mike, and look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Thank you.
Okay. It is my great joy and honor to introduce this year's Knowlton Jackson Distinguished Speaker, Dr. Patricia Maklouf. Patricia is Vice President of Oceana, Peru, and professor at Cayetano Heredia University, where she is the founder and past director of the Center for Environmental Sustainability, which is a program focused on cross-disciplinary challenges at the intersection of humans and the environment, a sister program to CNBC. She obtained her PhD in zoology at the University of Cambridge, worked as a scientist at the Wildlife Conservation Society for 20 years, and briefly served as the Vice Minister of Fisheries. Since 1982, Patricia has directed the longest running research program in coastal Peru, studying the impacts of El Nino and fisheries on fur seals and seabirds. This is when I met her, when, as young biologists, we thought that working in remote places surrounded by wild animals was enough, but it isn't. Rather, over the past 3 decades, Patricia has mostly singly led marine conservation issues in Peru, successfully promoting the establishment of marine protected areas and improving the sustainability of Peru's fisheries. She's a visionary in shaping climate-smart food systems in sustainable ways that protect marine biodiversity. She's perhaps best known for her campaign to raise public awareness of the ecosystem, human health, and economic impacts of the massive industrial anchoveta fishery. Anchoveta is a small fish in the anchovy family, is the cornerstone of the Humboldt ecosystem's productivity, and the massive fishery, the world's largest, affects the ecosystem's resilience. Patricia catalyzed a culinary revolution in Peru. Her successful initiative raised the value of anchoveta, diverting fish from low-value fish meal into human markets as a way to conserve oceans, improve food security and nutrition, while maintaining income for Peruvian fishermen. And they're delicious. For her outstanding contributions to marine conservation and for the inspiration she provides to marine conservationists around the globe to address seafood sustainability in innovative and significant ways, Patricia has received numerous awards, including the UK's Whitley Gold Award, a Guggenheim Fellowship, Pew Fellowship in Marine Conservation, Suman Award for contributions to sustainability of the Peruvian gastronomy movement, and Distinguished Service Award by the Society for Conservation Biology. From Lima, Peru, it is a pleasure for me to introduce friend and partner in our culinary conservation movement. Please join me in a warm round of virtual welcome for Patricia Maklouf.
Hi, hello everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm very delighted to be here and to be given this opportunity to speak to you about my work in Peru and over the last 40 years. For me, this honor is particularly special because it represents a full circle. In 1982, as I was just beginning my PhD, I had the very pleasant opportunity to spend a month at Scripps in preparation for my one and only trip to Antarctica as part of Dr. Jerry Koyman's research team. My time at Scripps was extremely important in my formation as a field scientist. I not only learned how to plan and organize complex expeditions, but also how to enjoy and appreciate the spectacular places we, as marine mammalogists, have the great fortune to spend time in. So although I will be talking today of my 40 years in marine conservation, I should say my life in science goes way back. I'm the daughter of this amazing couple, the first 2 child psychiatrists in Peru and part of the group of rebel doctors that founded the university where I ended up studying biology. I was literally raised to do a PhD. From very early on in my life, I was always told, when you do your PhD? And even worse, when I was 3 years old, my mom got me to learn English because I was going to need it because I was going to be a scientist. And she was right. Anyhow, eventually, I did end up doing a PhD in zoology in Cambridge, and this leads us to Punta San Juan. This is Punta San Juan, a tiny 54-hectare peninsula closed off from the mainland by a 3-meter tall wall that you can see here. where some of the most amazing aggregations of marine wildlife in Peru can be found. This site is also the place where the waters are 1 to 2 degrees cooler than anywhere else in Peru, and where some of the highest levels of primary productivity in the world have been recorded. All this is because here is where the edge of the continental shelf comes closest to the coast, and therefore intense upwelling is bringing very cold waters from great depths, and with it cooler conditions that allow animals such as fur seals and penguins that are adapted to colder environments can thrive. This is where my life by the Peruvian Ocean really started. So from 1982, when I began my PhD field research, I had the fortune of having WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society, support my research for 20 years to study the behavioral ecology of South American fur seals at this amazing site. Here I was able to follow and observe the detailed behavior of individually tagged animals consecutively for 2 decades. This provided me with a unique long-term insight into the very complex behavior of these animals and how they adapt to their highly volatile environment. Now, being at Scripps, you should know that in Peru, animals are subject to the recurrent occurrence of El Niño and La Niña events of varying intensities at irregular frequencies. These events cause the productivity of the ocean to fluctuate from the extreme abundance resulting from the strong upwelling typical of the usually cold waters of coastal Peru to extreme scarcity more typical of warm tropical waters. Strong El Niños, such as the ones in 1982-83 and 1997-98, can result in extreme predator mortalities. I started my PhD research at Punta San Juan during the strong 1982-83 El Niño, and in 1997-98, I had to stop because it resulted in the most extreme wildlife mortalities ever recorded in Peru. When El Niño peaked in December of 97, in 3 months, we saw 80% of the entire populations of fur seals, sea lions, and guano birds, and about half of the humble penguins die. This is what was left of my study beach. After 20 years studying the behavior of these animals, the beaches of Punta San Juan, which I'd always seen covered in vast numbers of seals and birds, were empty. Everything was dead in 3 months. Now, when you see this, clearly, I had to reevaluate my career. Since then, I have largely abandoned field research and have refocused my efforts on protecting the basic needs for marine wildlife to resist the more intense and more frequent El Niño events that may occur as a result of climate change. House and food. Since 1998, I have focused on increasing marine habitat protection and also improving fisheries policies to ensure the long-term survival and increase the resilience of the important populations of marine wildlife in Peru. So house. Punta San Juan is part of a system of 33 islands and peninsulas that spans the entire Peruvian coast that have been protected by the Peruvian government since 1909 to guard the populations of guano birds these include the Peruvian cormorants, Peruvian boobies, and brown pelicans, to extract and sell their feces as fertilizer. That is guano. These sites are minimally protected by a few guards and, as in the case of peninsulas like Punta San Juan, by protective walls to keep terrestrial predators away. But even with this minimal protection relative to the complete lack of it outside of these sites, marine wildlife, including mainly marine birds and mammals that require land for breeding, found refuge and aggregated there. At present, more than 90% of both the fur seal and sea lion populations of humble penguins and almost the entire guano bird population are found in these sites. So by increasing protection of the guano reserve system, almost the entire populations of the species we needed to secure could be protected in a single swoop. Also, the waters around these sites are some of the most important spawning and nursing grounds for many of the most important commercial species of seafood. So it was not difficult to persuade the Peruvian government to include the entire system into the National Protected Area System. Now, it took us 10 years, but finally in 2009, 100 years exactly after the first time the Peruvian government provided protection to these sites, the entire guano system was designated as only the second marine reserve established in Peru. So, how's check? Now, food. The main prey for fur seals, sea lions, penguins, guano birds, and most other seabirds and mammals and many species of fish in Peru is the Peruvian anchovy or anchoveta, a small forage fish which is the subject of the largest fishery in Peru and the second largest in the world. For centuries, the Peruvian coast has held extraordinarily large population of birds, mammals, and fish that thrive because of the astonishingly large biomasses of this fish. Now, let me first give you an idea of the scale of this fishery. Since the 1950s, when the anchoveta fisheries first started, millions of tons of this fish are caught annually off the coast of Peru. To give you an idea of the scale, the total amount of anchoveta caught in Peru is equivalent to 10% of all marine fish caught around the world since 1950. Furthermore, the amount of anchoveta caught annually in Peru is equivalent to that of over 100 countries summed together. Only China has significantly larger catches than Peru. However, Peru is catching only one species of fish caught within 100 kilometers off the coast, which is equivalent to less than 0.1% of the global ocean surface. China, in contrast, catches hundreds of species everywhere in the world. These massive catches clearly have had an important impact on the marine ecosystem. To give you an idea, here's the primary productivity flow through the ecosystem before and after the industrial anchoveta fishery was developed. Before the fishery, all the productivity of anchovies was taken by the guano birds and by other predators, or the multitude of predator species. Since the fishery was developed, it takes most of the anchoveta productivity, leaving a minor fraction of it to guano birds and other top predators. Now, as most small pelagics, the anchoveta is highly sensitive to environmental variations, and it suffers dramatic drops as a result of a combination of strong El Niño events and overfishing. When the anchoveta availability drops, all predators, including the fishery, suffer. In extreme cases, as in 1997-98, it results in extreme mortality, as I was telling you earlier. Now, we cannot affect the frequency and intensity of El Niño events, and with climate change, it is likely that El Niños will take place more frequently and perhaps stronger. So if we want to recover and increase the resilience of marine wildlife populations in Peru, it is clear that we need to fish less to leave more anchoveta in the water for these animals. Now, how to reduce anchoveta catches? The second question would be, why do we need to catch so much? The fact is that 98% of all anchoveta catches are reduced into fish meal and fish oil. It's a very low value product that requires huge quantities of fish to become economically viable. Now, why do we need so much fish meal and fish oil? These products are mostly used as feed for the international industrial animal production industries, which are increasingly using it for aquaculture and mostly fish oil. Now, a third of all marine fish nowadays are reduced into fish meal and fish oil. Why is this happening? This is the product of a growth problem. So if we know that we have increased human population growth, more humans demand more food, therefore you need more animal production, and this of course increases the demand for fish meal and fish oil to feed these animals. Now this leads to industrial fisheries, to increased overfishing, to increased pollution, increased ecological and social degradation, decrease food security, decrease human health, and decrease ecosystemic resilience and productivity. So in Peru, they call this, so turning fish into fish meal and fish oil, indirect human consumption, because they say that through the cow, we're eating the fish. So the question has always been, why is this fish not eaten directly? One of the most often given to justify using anchovetas only to produce fish meal is that people don't eat them. That anchovetas are only good for feeding animals, and that if we, Peru, don't catch them, someone else will. So the reverse makes sense too. If anchovetas turned out to be good nutritional food for people, it is wrong to feed them to animals, and we're much better off using them to feed the many poor and malnourished people in Peru. Now, another reason given to justify catching millions of metric tons of anchovetas to produce and export fish meal and fish oil is that this industry generates huge amounts of foreign income, and that our national economy would crash without it, and that no other use for this fish can provide as much money as it does. But then anchovies are not good in terms of nutrition. They're eaten all around the world, and they are delicious. Now, some people won't agree with me, but they are. So what we needed to do was to reposition anchovies from a perception of being seen as food for animals to be seen as food for people, from stinky oily fish to delicious fish, and not just for a poor man's food, but food that you aspire to eat, that you really wanted to eat it. Now, why do we need to do that? Because it's, first of all, tasty, delicious fish. It's abundant and cheap, very nutritious, and it also provides greater added value for this fish, which allows lower catches without income loss. It also increases global food security and, importantly, more sustainable and diverse uses for marine ecosystem, and perhaps a recovery to earlier times. So how did we try to do this? We did the Anchoveta Week. We did 4 of these events that included between 30 to 100 top restaurants and chefs in Peru, and tens of thousands, and during these events, tens of thousands of people tried anchovetas for the first time. Now, this was a really cool project because it resulted of a creative partnership. A cook, this is Gaston Acurio, the most famous chef in Peru, who has led the Peruvian food to become internationally trendy, and everything that he touches turns into gold. He is the one that has led Peruvians to try many new products, the biologist, and a graphics designer, because we thought this was important to call the attention of people through the eyes as well. So we appeal to people through the stomach and through the eyes. Also, because this was such an unusual association, biology, conservation, food, fancy chefs. So this called the attention of the media, called the attention of politicians. And so soon we had huge media events. This is a lunch that happened during the first Anchoveta Week. We have the president sitting at the head of in the middle of the table, and all his ministers and all the top businessmen involved in the fishery. This was followed up by a publication of recipes in one of the most popular newspapers. But most important, there was increased availability in the markets. People could finally find this fish. Before these events happened, no one had ever tried anchovetas because they were nowhere to be found in the markets. Now, something that definitely helped was that we let the government believe that it was their own idea. So they took it as their own, and they went around actively promoting anchoveta consumption. This is the minister at the time frying fish all over the place. Now this was a really, really fast change. And within 20 months, we had increased consumption by 130% from 35,000 metric tons in July 2006 to 85.5 in 2008, and even to 120,000 by 2012. Companies invested in processed products. There were over 24 different products in a single market. There was 85% increase in the production of canned anchoveta. Frozen anchovies became available. And interestingly, 95% of the people that we surveyed liked it, would eat it again, and would give it to their families and consider them a nutritious, tasty food. And then Peru started actively promoting the exports of canned and frozen anchovies. Now, why did we succeed? There had been many previous efforts to get Peruvians to eat anchoveta. The food aid programs from Technological Institute in Peru, FAO, Japanese cooperation, but these efforts were limited by low availability in local markets. Also, it was pretty bad PR. The fish were being presented as food for the poor, and they didn't even bother with taste or presentation. Often they served the fish without salt or bad cans, etc. So the main reason that we think we were successful was because we showed that they were really good to eat. These are the dishes that were presented in that recipe book that I showed you earlier. We got 30 chefs, 40 chefs to produce 60 recipes, and they were very cheap, very nutritious, and easy to produce. These were all obviously inspired in existing recipes in the Peruvian gastronomy, but definitely this helped people. People love to eat fish, and they love to eat dark fish. So when they were presented with anchovies, they had no problem eating them. But then the other thing that was very important is, as I told you before, people thought that the only use that you could have for anchovies was to do fish meal. We then proceeded to do a study of the value chain of anchovies and in general of the fishing sector in Peru, not only up to the landing point, but looking at until the last user in the value chain. So when we compared the revenue of anchovies, of fish in the reduction sector, in the fish meal, fish oil sector, with that of human consumption, and each of these levels it's using a kind of a trophic level structure to facilitate understanding. We found that of the money that was produced in the fishing sector, only 31% was produced by the fish meal and fish oil industry. The value from seafood enterprises was 69%. Now it's much higher. We haven't updated yet the value chain, but there's a lot more restaurants and a lot more, well, up until last year before the pandemic. And the uses of fish have expanded tremendously. But more importantly, in employment, only 13% were generated by the reduction industry. 80%, 87%, or 200,000 jobs were generated by the seafood enterprises. This goes all the way to restaurants, to homes, to wholesalers. Interesting also is that there were more waiters in restaurants than fishers at sea. So we usually look at fisheries by the landing value, but if we have to look at the value of fish further up in the value chain, because these products are generating so much value in the country that has never been appreciated. Right now, the tourist industry, which includes, most of the fancy food that is being produced in Peru, it's equivalent to about 6% of our GDP. The whole fishing industry is only 2%, out of which a third is already human consumption. So that idea that only using the anchovies for fish, for producing fish meal was the only valuable use for this fish is not true. You can eat it, but if you don't eat it, you can leave it at sea and let the other fish eat them, and then these fish will be more available for the food industry, and then you produce a lot more money and a lot more jobs. So if we can get more money, doing less harm, employing more people all year round, and most importantly, providing optimal food for the poor and malnourished in our country, using a lot less fish, how can we continue justifying using all of our very large catch of anchovies only to make fish meal with it? Clearly we can't. So that's the reason why I embarked on a quest to get more people to eat more fish. This is to eventually create the conditions for my country to be able to afford decreasing its total catch of anchovies, therefore not losing, but increasing the benefits provided by this resource, not only to humans, but to marine mammals, seabirds, and other species in the ecosystem as well. Peruvian food has become fashionable. For the last 7 years, Peru is the top foodie destination in the world for 7 years. So using these tools is very, very, very good. So going back to the beginning, I'm a scientist, but sadly have come to realize that scientific research has little effect on policies and practices affecting natural resource use. Global market needs and political greed and ignorance push unsustainable uses that lead to environmental poverty, creating a perverse cycle leading to ever-decreasing environmental quality and local welfare. For 20 years, I used the traditional tools I was given through my training as a biologist, thinking it would help protect the places and species I cared about, only to see them all die in 3 months at the peak of the most intense El Nino ever recorded in history. There was nothing I could do about El Nino, so I had to find other ways to achieve change. My work is still very much based on science, but now I have new tools and new allies. The chefs, these are the most effective communicators now in the world. They're the new rock stars, and their job also depends on fish. As a scientist and using the language of science, there's little chance to convince people of the need for change. However, there's one thing I'm sure will get Peruvians to jump to protect their fish. Just tell them no fish, no ceviche, and everyone will be ready to fight. So, as the saying goes, all is fair in love and war. And so we should all try new tools, and you may end up eating nice stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia. And it's getting late in the afternoon. We're getting hungry. It would be great. We are open for questions. Remember to put your questions in the Q&A box. And we have, let's see, I think we have the first question coming in. Is that from Catherine Harwin? What sorts of pushback did you experience when trying to implement these protection measures, and how did you overcome them? And I think these protection measures could be quite large from your talk, either in the house or in the food side. So I'll let you take that question the direction you want to go.
Well, in the house, as I told you, it took me 10 years to get it done. We had the fisheries very strongly opposing it because by protecting these areas, we're basically protecting the entire coastline, and they felt that they had to be given places where they could go through, and we had to shape the buffer areas around each site so that they could have places to pass around them and then leave the beaches open for the people to go there. It took a while, but we managed to get them done because the government recognized these were the most important sites off the coast, and so they created a law that made it nationally important to do it. It took several years after that as well, but we did it. For the human consumption, interestingly enough, it didn't have a lot of resistance because we framed it in a way that it was a win-win for everyone. Because at the time there was only one factory in Lima that was producing good quality anchovy cans. These were anchovies not in the style that most people know, the little brown salty fish that you find in pizzas, but these were produced in a way very similar to canned sardines. These are steamed and then canned in oil or tomato sauce. And so when I went to talk to Gaston, the chef, and gave him the can, and he said, "Oh, great! I mean, how do we start?" I was frustrated that I could never find a product with which I could do a nice meal. And so we gave these anchovies to all the chefs, and all the chefs got really excited. And in a week, we had them all recruited, maybe 10-minute calls for each one of them. And when we started, it was such a neat alliance, conservation and food, and it included Gaston. There was, the biggest star in the country. And it just got people excited. And then the top restaurants started giving people the little hors d'oeuvres for free. And so they would sit down and they would be given anchovies, and they could taste them. And so everyone liked them. And then people started buying them a lot. And then the companies realized that there was a market for it, and they started investing millions in canning and freezing fish. And the government then drew a law that said that it was strategically national strategic value to promote anchovies for human consumption, and then said that they would use 8% of their total food budget for all social and military programs in anchovies. So there was this immediately created this big market. So the company said, "Oh, great." And so because they were using not a lot of fish and it wasn't affecting their big fish meal catches, they didn't resist. They actually jumped at the opportunity. Now, the problem was that the big catches, the big catch quota, unfortunately by law, it can only be used for fish meal, but they still take some of it and use it for human consumption. And so this happened. It was like, really amazing to see how everything just came into place. Within 6 years, we did a survey of asking people, what do you think about when you hear the word anchovies? And they said, well, fish, stinky, fish meal. And 6 years later, it was food, cans, nutrition. The fish meal and the bad no-shows were way down the list. They basically disappeared. And so it was, I guess, a lucky time and a good coincidence and a good thing to do. And people, especially at the time, we were first realizing that we had huge levels of child malnourishment, and this was a very good potential solution for it.
Thank you. The next question comes from one of our students in the sustainable seafood class and follows on on the question that you just answered about this was a really quick transition. What you were able to do in 6 years takes people in other fisheries and other places decades or may never be successful. The question is whether you saw the fastest transition in the fishing industry, in restaurant and retail, or in consumption, and by private citizens. And I think it's a really interesting question because these drivers of innovation and change, how you reach them, and then how they can, through their networks, catalyze change throughout a system. You mentioned working with some amazing chefs, but it has to catch on.
Yep.
So where did you see this with the industry, retail, or public?
In the early years when we first started, you could see it going very much at all growing simultaneously. The production, because the industry invested in all the processing factories, the availability of products increased tremendously. At some point, a couple of years after we started, you could go to a supermarket and all you could see on the shelves was anchovy products. It was just amazing. And before, you could find the can maybe way down if you could find it. However, after that, the industry started a big fight with the government because the government wanted to increase protection to the coastal areas that are reserved for artisanal fishers, and they expanded the area of protection. And then the industry said, if you're saying that this is because you want to increase production for human consumption, that's not going to happen. So they stopped producing cans, and whatever they produced, they exported it. So it just happened that at some point, you couldn't find a single can anywhere in the country. So now they have gone back up to producing a lot. They're at the top levels at about 150,000 tons of production, but it's all being exported. So we're now working with the government to try to create the incentives to bring back the production for local consumption so that people can restart using it. We had to stop. That's why we only did four events, because around the fourth we found that we couldn't get enough supply for the people to use them, and so we had to stop.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting evolution, almost unintended consequences, or if something becomes popular, other people are going to want it. It's always moving, as well as I know a lot of the management on the water management issues are continually moving.
Mm-hmm.
And let me follow up on that conversation though with another question from Joe Vichinsky, along the lines of what we were talking. Do you believe changing people's attitudes about eating fish, such as the anchovy, smelly, oily, not good to eat, is something that can be done in a generation, or would it be more feasible to inform opinions over a few generations? And I think you've answered part of that, but I'm wondering.
No, it can happen very quickly, because especially in a population like Peru that likes to eat all types of fish. When you ask people in Peru, they like mackerel, they like bonito, which are dark flesh fish. So anchovies, they hadn't eaten them because you couldn't find them. But as soon as we provided that access to a diversity of products, people started consuming them, and they really liked them. Of course, there's always going to be people that don't like them because they don't like fish or they're allergic to fish. But usually that was around only 5% of the population. Everyone else that wanted, that found the fish, they found it, very appropriate to prepare in many different forms that were typical of the way we eat fish. Perhaps some of the one of the difficulties in when you try to take the fish to the highland areas where the worst malnourishment is found was the fact that you could sell them, you could find them in frozen form or in cans, and there's no electricity in the mountains, and the cans usually are more expensive than the content of fish. So we had to find new formats so that people could get larger portions in containers that weren't as expensive as a can, and you could use there's these aluminum pouches that can hold a pound or a kilo, and also dried fish. And dried fish proved to be extremely acceptable, because people in Peru for centuries have eaten dried fish. So if you brought the right fish, people would eat it very easily. They would accept it immediately. So it's a matter of exploring, you know, the different markets and finding the right products. Also, you could take the product and not say it's anchovy. You can say it's fish, and people will take it because people are used to eating fish stuff and not have a specific name attached to it.
You mentioned two other species, mackerel and bonito. So what's interesting is the flavor Peruvians have for these full flavored fish. Going back to that last question, where sometimes flavors are lost, like sardine was a big market here for a long time. That market crashed and people stopped eating sardine. Mackerel is another species off the coast here. We call them the underloved. Most of our coastal pelagics, our anchovy, our sardine, our market squid are not, and mackerel are not eaten locally. They're used as bait or reduction, or they're eaten elsewhere where people appreciate them. So
Japan loves them. I mean, people in Japan will, you know, will eat any kind of fish, I guess.
No. So it's interesting to see how a culture can lose taste for something as well as have it come back given the opportunity. I
was lucky that I met this guy whose father lived in one of the coastal towns in northern Peru, very near one of the places where they caught a lot of anchovies. And he told me that when he was a kid, that he was pretty badly behaved, so he was left to clean up the classroom. And what he found was little heads of anchovies all over the floor. And it turned out that the children would take dried anchovies in their pockets, and that's what they would munch on all day long. And it was highly nutritious food. I mean, this was this is before the fishery started, and then it all disappeared because the fishery took it all, and it started saying that this was not an edible fish.
Yeah. And I thought your the way of introducing this using the chefs and being able to promote the product at the highest culinary levels sets the stage as well for consumption across.
That turns it into an aspirational food. I mean, people want to eat what these chefs produce, you know. If you see it in a beautiful plate, you know, a delicious plate, you want to eat it. If someone comes with a sausage made out of fish that smells kind of weird, you're not going to eat them. Or cans that are, you know, instead of using oil, they used water. And so when you opened it, all the scales were floating in the water. So it looked bad and it smelled bad. You don't want to eat that. I mean, there's many studies where even the most malnourished people won't eat stuff because it just smells bad or tastes bad and they don't like it. So people will eat what they like. People will eat what's tasty. So you just want to make food as nice as you can. And it's not difficult. You just fry them and they're delicious.
Yeah, and that when I work with chefs, it's always and it's delicious. That we forget that that is a key part of the secret of making these things work. Yeah. We have a question from Lisa Levin, thanking you for the wonderful presentation and asking, has anyone done quantitative health studies of benefits of incorporating substantial amounts of anchoveta into human diets?
Yeah, here in Peru, there's been many studies using anchoveta. In a few decades ago, they would take these really malnourished children and they would, you know, give them enriched foods with anchoveta, and they ended up with these obese little children because it's extremely nutritious. I worked with a nutritionist and she said that with a pound of anchovies a week, you cover all your nutritional requirements except for energy. So you need to eat a pound of fish plus some carbs. So French fries and fish and chips.
It doesn't sound hard.
Yeah.
I'd like to bring Mike Navarro back to the stage here. And then we can take questions for either of our guests. And I'm watching the chat box. Bring them on. Bring on those questions. Let me start by asking, what's your favorite preparation of squid and anchoveta? And then I'll take the next question.
Wow.
How do you like to eat your market squid?
Well, I think there's some Italian recipes that are pretty good. I think anything but fried is my preference. Fried is, I mean, we eat it, but it's just, I kind of agree with the chefs in that it's a little bit lazy. And so, yeah, just different ways. And as far as the anchoveta, like many of you out there, I am looking to incorporate it more into my diet for sure. And so, thank you.
So what's your favorite preparation?
Any kind of pasta with anchovies, you know, puttanesca and you know, the thing is that you have to remember that anchovies are the basis for the flavorings in many parts of the world. So the umami that comes from anchovies, and so soy sauce, Worcester sauce, the fish sauce in Southeast Asia, they're all anchovies. So anything you put the anchovies on, it's delicious. Mm-hmm. But I do like fried fish. I love fried fish, and so it's always delicious. And you can eat the whole thing, bones and all.
Mm-hmm. And really good for the extra calcium.
Yep.
We have a question from Daniel Conley. How much did the increase of direct consumption of anchoveta decrease the annual landing of anchoveta?
The direct consumption of anchoveta is still too low to see a significant decrease in the landings for reduction, because, as I said, the quota for reduction is only used for reduction. You can't use any of that for human consumption. So everything that's taken for human consumption comes from the artisanal fisheries. So it's now been combined into the quota. So there's separate quotas, and it's still 130,000 tons is not even 5% of the total catch. What did decrease the annual landing is a new regulation that at some point the government accepted, which was to use an exclusion rule that you would leave 4 to 6 million tons of fish in the water, and you could catch the anything that was over that. And so when that happened, that dropped the total catch quota from 8 to 10 million down to 4 to 6. And that meant that the price of anchovy, of fish meal and fish oil globally went enormously up. And so they were catching a lot less, and they were winning exactly the same amount of money. So they were happy with catching less without, you know, and even though the human consumption it hasn't increased yet to a level that it will affect the reduction.
We have a question from David Checkley. He's asking about the gear that's used, and is there a difference between the gear that's used when you're catching fish for a reduction fishery and the gear that you need to use if you're actually going to eat the fish? And that leads to a question not just about the gear, but about the vessels themselves.
The gear doesn't change. You can use the same gear, but you need to have your hold able to keep ice, to keep it cold. And so the larger boats of the big industrial boats, they're perfect because they have these cold water refrigeration systems. So you can have the fish floating in these enormous volumes of slush, and so it arrives on port in perfect state. Whereas the smaller artisanal boats, they have to use almost half their hold to put boxes and to put ice, because you can't pile the fish in too high a level because it gets crushed. So that's kind of a disincentive for the small scale fishers to use that to go catch for human consumption, whereas it should be an incentive for the big guys to do it. There's still some work we need to do with the legislation to be able to switch that. But it's the idea would be a boat that is larger than what we now consider artisanal boats, with a hull that can accommodate these larger containers that can hold a lot of ice. And so, because right now, ice and mostly what I said, a slush, so that the fish can float in it. If you have the little boxes, you can only put so much in the boxes because it gets crushed. And also, the ice lasts longer if they're in larger volumes. So, it's a lot to do still, but it's a first step.
Okay, in the last couple minutes, I'd like to return the stage to both of you for final comments, and particularly on your views of this balance between preserving biodiversity and human well-being. And of course, I'm particularly fond of solutions where we can eat our way out of the problem. This culinary conservation approach, we call it. Like to hear your closing thoughts for a couple moments. And Mike, we have about a minute or two, or actually 1 minute, and then Patricia.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, when you run into as many challenges as we have with climate change, it kind of breeds innovation. So I think that's exciting in as far as thinking about different types of foods, also diversifying just the types of foods we eat is increasingly important, especially I think the microbe community of researchers are finding exciting evidence to show that if you diversify what you eat, that's really healthy for you. I think a lot of the things that we do that improve mental well-being at the same time are going to be important. And seafood is one of the most promising areas where we can improve our diet, as for many of the reasons that Dr. Majluf mentioned. And here in Alaska, we have a huge mariculture burgeoning, and growing kelp is going to be part of the solution in Southeast Alaska too. So on with that.
Thank you, Mike. Patricia.
Yeah, I remember at some point I was writing a document, and then the heading was fishing for food or for money, and I was, Daniel Pauly was around, and he said, well, it shouldn't be or, it can be and, because you can get a lot more value by producing food, and definitely you see some fish that are, and even anchovies. You go to Europe, and some cans of anchovies can cost €9. I've even sold some of the Peruvian anchovy cans in these very fancy Terra Madre food festivals in Italy for €4, whereas here in Peru it costs half $1. And people were happy to pay that because they found them delicious, and they're, if they can afford them and they couldn't find them anywhere else, they just paid for it. And so I think we should find ways to make these products more valuable, but also you shouldn't get the price too high up, because then people can't eat them. So we have this dichotomy, right? So if you have money, you eat fish for your health, for there's many reasons for eating good. It's good protein, all your nutrition. But for poor people, it's survival. It's nourishment. You get so many children that don't have enough. When you grow without the right combination of nutrients, you grow up what they call stunted. So you never learn, you never grow properly, and therefore ever you can't recover from that. If you don't get the right nutrition in your first 2 years, you're never ever going to get your right development. So we need to find, a balance in how to use these fish. And so it can't happen what happened with quinoa. Now, everyone wants to eat quinoa, and quinoa costs a fortune. And people in the Andes that used to have quinoa all the time to eat, now they can't afford it. So these are the kind of questions we need to work with, because if we have enough fish to feed everyone in Peru, with 1 million tons, we feed the entire population of Peru the pound of fish that they need to eat. And we fish about 6 million tons a year. So we could fish a lot more, we could feed a lot more people and make a lot more money and produce fish meal, because a third of that volume is heads and tails and that you can't eat, so you make them into fish meal. And so you just need to get people to accept the possibilities and maybe get the government to support them, because they're still into the prioritization of fish meal because that's easy money.
Well, thank you both. These are daunting challenges, feeding the world without depleting our ocean resources, made more urgent by climate change and COVID. I thank you for your forward thinking on this. I am looking forward. Our Sustainable Seafood Initiative at Scripps addresses many of these big issues, and we're waiting for the Woodstock of culinary, the getting on the Food Channel and sharing this link between what you eat and your ability to save the oceans. With that, I want to thank both of you very much. I want to thank Nancy and Jeremy for setting us on this path with this lecture series and for founding the Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation. Thank you very much, and I'm turning this over to Stuart for closing remarks.
Well, clearly the world has changed a little bit. There's sunlight in my eyes, and I'm looking forward to an anchoveta dinner. I really do look forward to having to watching the history replay as it did with lobster, bluefin tuna, where we changed from them being trash food to valued food. And I see the same thing happening through the great work that you're talking about there, Patricia. So welcome Conversation Inspiring Words. So let me reiterate my congratulations to Patricia Maklouf as our 2021 Knowlton Jackson Distinguished Speaker, and Mike Navarro, our honored CNBC alumnus. I want to thank the efforts of the selection committee who brought you these honorees, Dr. Sarah Mesnick, Lisa Levin, Greg Rouse, and Samantha Murray. And special thanks to Nancy Knowlton and Jeremy Jackson for making this annual event even possible. This event's a wonderful opportunity for us to connect with our global leaders in marine biodiversity and conservation. And through this seminar and with the meetings that come along with the visit of Patricia and Mike back to Scripps, the speakers serve as an inspiration and motivation for our students. Patricia and Mike are inspirations to me as well, and I bet you with all of you. The Knowlton Jackson Distinguished Speaker Series is an invaluable opportunity for our CNBC community to gather and to share updates on how the world's changing and how this family is engaging to make these changes move in the direction that we hope for. It's a delight to see you all here today, and we look forward to the next time that you'll join us for a visit. And maybe next time we'll see you in our new Marine Conservation and Technology facility, the building that's on the north end of the Scripps campus, and it'll be the new home of CNBC. At MCTF, we'll have opportunities to continue these conversations and to start new ones, and maybe even have conversations over a plate of locally prepared seafood. Anchoveta might be shipped in as well. And for those of you joining from afar, don't worry, we'll be hosting these events in a hybrid setting, in person and with a virtual connection. If the changes over the last year have taught us anything, it's that our community expands well beyond the borders of San Diego. So with that, thank you all. And please join me one last time in congratulating our honored speakers. Thank you and good night.